So genre crossovers have been on the mind a lot lately because it seems like I can't write a single story without pulling on multiple genres, which is making organizing my work a little difficult because when you have as many different books as I have and they're popping up into multiple different genres, representing stories in the correct genres and categorizing all those stories is becoming something of a nightmare. I think the only books that I haven't gone crazy with genres on is like a coloring book. And depending upon the topic, the coloring book can turn into both a coloring book and an educational piece. So you can really sort of blur the lines even in something as extreme as that. But going back to the first stories that I was writing and putting together in the Guardsman series and the Symbiote, for example, is sort of a modern military and science fiction. Not so much a historical fiction, but at the beginning of that book, it does talk about historical events and then takes sort of a 90-degree turn from those historical events that anchored the story. Guardsman, for example, that's these three up here, and then Symbiote's this one up here. The Guardsman, for example, touches on three basic genres. It touches on science fiction. It's a thriller because of the chasing, the running around and trying to survive kind of stuff. And then it's also a mystery. It's a mystery because we start off in kind of a not so fun position because stuff was being put into the mix that shouldn't have been put into the mix. And we've got people getting knocked around by the powers that be, both foreign and domestic in that case. And how are we going to get ourselves out of this and reclaim our life? So that's kind of the question that starts off with the Guardsman. The Guardsman is sort of a military thriller because it's very similar to the Jack Carr run and gun, survive the situation kind of writing. And Jack Carr's work is intense because he knows exactly what he's talking about. And there are times when I'm reading or listening to his work, and then I have to go to the internet and look up exactly what he's talking about because he mentions weapons and, oh, okay, I know what that weapon is. And then he'll mention an aspect or a use for that weapon. And I'll be like, I need to look that up because I think I know what it is, but his technical proficiency as a Navy SEAL is just fantastic. What he is doing with the reality and his modern military thriller work is sort of a benchmark. I published The Guardsman earlier, but 2011, when mine came out, that was sort of how I was putting things together. I had not read the Terminal series, but there's a lot of similarities there, which is kind of cool. It would be arrogant of me to say great minds thinking alike because his dedication to the craft is impeccable. There are a lot of ways that we can cross our genres. Some genres naturally tie in together. So a science fiction, modern military thriller makes sense. They're kind of compatible. On the flip side of that, if we have a science fiction thriller, it gets a little bit harder to mix in the educational or the coloring book piece because it just doesn't really fit. In a lot of stories, you'll find that there's a romance element. There's an element of the interpersonal relationship. Lord of the Rings sort of glosses over those relationships because it's basically 9 dudes in the woods. But you're really not going to have, for example, a movie or a film that comes out that doesn't have some kind of romantic piece because when you're presenting and marketing those films, half of your audience is female, and you can't just have a hack and slash all the time. The romantic interest is going to get played in. I think it was Arnold Schwarzenegger's Total Recall back in the day that he violated the personal kill count for a character by some obscene number. But even in that movie, where there was Sharon Stone was the nominal wife, and then there was the other girl. That other girl was the romantic interest. So even that science fiction shoot 'em up thriller had that romantic component to it. Sometimes those things tie in naturally. Anytime that you get that story where rescue the princess, ride off into the sunset, pretty much no matter how you're getting into it, be it a science fiction, be it a modern military thriller, be it a fantasy kind of realm, you're going to end up with some element of that interpersonal romancy kind of stuff. There's sort of a connection there. So there's the interpersonal connection there that can help you appeal to a broader audience. So whereas Total Recall had that massive kill count, the interpersonal relationships boosted the stakes. It wasn't just some guy going out there with a pew-pew and making a mess of things. It was, how do we protect this person that we care about? And by adding those stakes with that romance element in a bloodbath of a movie like Total Recall, you suddenly have a greater emotional bond to the protagonist who is trying to protect, who is trying to free the world, who is trying to, etc. As far as the inspiration for getting into mixing genres, it seems natural in a lot of cases because some genres naturally relate. Using the Total Recall, it makes sense that he's trying to save the girl, etc. He's trying to save the girl at the same time he's trying to save Mars. Looking into Jack Carr's Terminal series, it opens up with a horrendous murder. Series of horrendous murders. Because of how the Terminal list kicks off, it would be unnatural for Jack Carr to write in a romance piece into that story for his main character. I don't want to spoil it. Read it, listen to it yourself. It's powerful. Building the emotional connections parallel to our main character in the Terminal list makes sense. The romance between the best friend and his wife and his emotional connection to his family. Now you have stakes when something bad happens to the friend. Now you have stakes when something bad happens to the friend's wife. Because there is that character building, because the parents of the friend have their element of romance and emotional connection, we can connect to that as humans. That builds stakes. Because we care about these people who care about other people in the story, the stakes are higher when bad things happen. Adding that element of the romance and the element of the family and the element of the emotional connection boosts our anxiety over those characters when they need help. Using multiple genres in our work and in support when it flows naturally is important. The inclusion of multiple genres that flow naturally is important because if we suddenly step outside of our thriller and we start talking about monsters, that modern military thriller, that suddenly a werewolf shows up, that suddenly a supernatural shows up, may not really make sense in the context of our story. In the Terminal series, it would not make sense for a werewolf to show up. Caveat: some science fiction-y thing gets pulled in where somebody is trying to reanimate dead flesh and create a bunch of zombie creatures that they can use to hunt protagonists in a future endeavor. Maybe that's something that gets woven in, but it has to make sense in the context of the world. So as we're doing our world building, it sort of helps to have that in mind before we get down the road. When we're doing our world building, we need to understand what elements of genre we plan to include. When we plan to include science fiction, military thriller, mystery, throw in a dash of romance, do we really need zombies showing up? Do we really need dragons showing up? Where you pull in that fantasy, where you start pulling in that monster? Do we need the werewolves? Not really. Do we need the biographical stuff dumped in there? Not really. That would be a little bit off the beaten path. Because if we're doing a fictional work, there's no need to include biography genre. When we go and throw in real world stuff, we can get a little bit distracted from the plot. I think it was Shara, I think the guy's name was, but the Little Red Badge of Courage about the Civil War in the United States was historical fiction. There were biographical aspects in that story. I don't think the unit itself in that story was real, but the units to like the left and the right were. So when you have this character in this Civil War historical fiction, there needs to be an element of biography included in your historical fiction, because there are people out there who, when you're walking the Battle of Gettysburg with them, the colonel closed his notes, flipped them over his finger, and then took us off in a tangent. And we spent 45 minutes walking around this loop of territory, and he just went off script. And we circled around and came right back to where he was on his presentation. He flipped that presentation back open, and he kept talking without looking at the presentation. And he was flipping through that presentation as he went without looking at it. He knew the pages of his Gettysburg presentation that well because he taught at the War College. The United States Army War College is close to Gettysburg, so they go there all the time. The colonel was so astutely aware of the position and disposition and leadership of every single unit, north and south, at the Battle of Gettysburg, that he could stand at any point on the battlefield and point to where every single unit was at a specific point in time during the battle. There are people with that level of knowledge. So if you go and try to start writing your historical fiction and you don't know that, you suddenly put yourself into a spot where you blow your credibility. Understanding that it's a work of historical fiction, there needs to be the element of the historical in there, which means that you need to do the biographical research and weave that in side by side. And then you need to be consistent with it. Because if you place your fictional character into an existing real unit, and that real unit, for example, at Gettysburg, was in the cavalry unit that initially engaged Lee's army, and that cavalry unit held because they had XYZ rifle. The next day of the battle, your fictional cavalryman should not be on top of Little Round Top. Little Round Top was an infantry engagement because it was covered in trees. And the units were different. It would be jarring for your cavalryman one day to suddenly be an infantryman the other day. Were you in the position where you were writing an individual in a historical fiction where they are moving with a specific unit, you have to basically do a biography of the unit and write your character into those actions. Done right, that could be a riveting story, because the meeting engagement that happened at Gettysburg, for example, was intense. There was a lot going on in that first day, and it was just regiment after regiment from both sides, just kept getting poured into this meat grinder. It was a meeting engagement between two huge armies, and neither commander wanted to be there. But by the time that the first day was over, so many troops were involved that they couldn't get away from each other. So they had to fight it out, which is really not how you want to fight. The creative process between mixing your genres, when I am getting caught, oh, what? Right. I have one story I'm writing. It's Marcus the Warrior. And I haven't really decided on a fixed firm title for that, but basically he goes out and he's having fun and etc. And there's a lot of different genres in there. It's a fantasy, which fantasy naturally segues in with the monsters. There's a romancy piece, that there's stakes involved. There's a bit of a mystery thrown in there because somebody gets dumped into this guy's life. Got to figure out who this person is. So there's 4, maybe 5 different genres that this book plays in. Another fantasy story that I need to publish soon is Razormouth. Razormouth uses the detail of historical fiction using historical weaponry, etc., as a background, but also ties in old fiction. So I take the Beowulf story, the original Beowulf story, and I right angle it. At the point of the Beowulf story where he's going to kill the dragon, I right angle the story, but the characters are essentially the same. The names are different. In that story, there's that very light historical fiction, and it goes immediately into the fantasy realm. But then we have the monsters. We've got quests from the monsters. We've got quests to kill monsters. We have to deal with the politics and such like that. There's also the romancy thing that he gets dumped into as a thread of destiny is being pulled. That one does not have much mystery. That one's mostly hack and slash, but the philosophical question of destiny driving action or action driving destiny, and how the free will ties in. So that's the question that we're playing with in that story. The creative process for me, especially in the fiction side of things, typically driven by the goal for the story, the overarching goal for the story, how that story is going to be told. When I get into the real stuff, the reality-based stuff, the biographies and such, that's much more restricted. If I'm interviewing someone for a book, a professional book, that professional book is not written by me. I may ask the questions. The person who's being interviewed is telling the story, not me. I don't get to bring out what they present, which is typically going to be about their business. The question about how readers respond has been mostly positive. When I am crafting a story, I typically get as many emails about the book as I get reviews in the book, which is kind of wild. I'm not quite sure why that is. The Guardsman in particular, I think that thing has got like 40 reviews on the first book. That's Honor the Fallen. I think that Honor the Fallen has got like 40 reviews on Amazon. And I know I've fielded about 50 emails on that book. And there were some pretty interesting conversations. And I've had some people come up with some really wild ideas to expand the Guardsman universe. They are outlined. They have not moved forward in quite some time. I do have ideas for the Guardsman about expansions based upon conversations with fans of the book, which is kind of wild. It's really cool. One of them is the formation of the corporate empires, the who's and the whys that drove humanity to a corporatized governance outside of the Earth sphere, the immediate sphere of influence of Earth. And basically, it's the Pony Express versus the telegraph kind of thing. In the Guardsman universe, there's no telegraph where you can quickly communicate over vast distances. Had the leaders of Earth had that ability, for they sold all of the worlds outside of Earth proper, they might have kept a better reign on things and not corporatized and sold those worlds off. Because effectively, if you're out of communication for 10 years while you're waiting for a slow, old ship to get someplace, how far off the rails do things go? The American Revolution was like 3 months across the waves. So the back and forth communication took 6 months for one round of communication between England and the United States. If you've got a generation passing as a slow ship is moving between the stars because your drives are too young, you're never going to talk to the same people. You're having generational conversations, meaning like, I have a conversation with you, you respond, my kid gets it, my successor gets it. So you have a very difficult time having those long distance communications. In the Guardsman universe, the answer was to basically sell the world under a charter. One of the books I have outlined is that formation and that why, how the families evolved, etc. like that. Another book I have outlined for the Guardsman is effectively filling in the final chase and the final pursuit with the long-range surveillance team that ends the story, finishes the chase. And that perspective is basically different from the whole rest of the book, but it's in the world. And it runs in parallel with the Guardsman and then goes 10, 15 years for Honor the Fall. Because there's a very particular set of skills that have been built over a very long time, very long career, that are brought into play to bring the Guardsman to conclusion. And those skills, those trainings, those units suffer. So that conversation, riding along with those soldiers, those mercenary soldiers, serving this corporate empire and being well paid for it, how do they interact? And I wanted to show how the military corporation interacted with the story. So because of the strong positive reader responses, because people could relate to the save the girl, save the world, to paraphrase Heroes, the save the cheerleader, save the world thing, that little touch of emotional connection, that little romance connection, allows people of both genders to quickly connect with, yeah, I can see myself in this, because the Guardsman moves between the two perspectives, the male and female perspective. So as far as response goes, while I've been disappointed at the number of reviews we've received, the email responses have been mind-blowing. Exploring genre crossovers for me has been entertaining because it adds colors to the coloring book. I'm not just coloring in black and white, which is funny based upon my coloring books, which is all black and white animals, but that's fine. The experimenting with blending genres for me has paid off because I'm doing it deliberately in the fiction. I don't experiment when I'm doing the biographies in the business space. But there are natural genres that tie in together and make sense side by side. If we have an experienced business professional and he is explaining to us how to do something in an interview-based book, that is not only biographical because it's that person's experience. It is an educational based book, which is powerful because now we're learning from somebody else's experience. By the same token, we can pull in more genre in the fiction side of things because fantasy goes well with the monsters. The monster in horror makes sense based upon how we thread it into the other genres. So a monster and horror thriller makes a lot of sense if you're into that kind of paranormal, getting chased by ghosts kind of thing. It depends how we establish our world early on. That's really going to drive how our genres cross over. It's getting a little bit long, but hope that helps. Have a great day.